Okay, last time we talked about how to solve quadratic equations by taking the square root and by factoring. Now we're going to learn a method that probably most of y'all have not heard of before or done before called completing the square. And so we're going to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. It's like a 5-step process, and so you might want to write this down. You can stop the video and write this down, but I'm just going to be going through the steps as I solve it. Step number 1, if this is ax squared plus bx plus c is 0, move c, this number right here, to the right-hand side. Then if a, the leading coefficient, does not equal to 1, divide both sides by that number. Then you're going to add this special quantity, which causes to a perfect square trinomial, b over 2 quantity squared. When you add that, it creates a perfect square, something like this. X plus something squared. That's what it's always going to create. And what you're always going to put right here is b over 2 is what's going to go right there. You'll see that in a second. This is actually factoring. It's not magic. You are actually factoring this so that if you multiply this back out, you will get what you had before. And then you've created something squared equals something, and then we're going to finish solving it by taking the square root. So the easiest way to see it is just going through a few examples. So we're just going to go through a few examples real quick. The first one is number 1. We have x squared, y is equal to x squared minus 4x minus 12. So if, for example, they said find the zeros of this function, find the zeros. When you're finding the zeros of a function, which means the x-intercepts, you let y be 0. And so now we have to solve this quadratic equation. So we're not going to factor it. We're going to do it by completing the square. So a is 1, b is -4, c is -12. To solve by completing the square, we're going to move c to the right-hand side. And so we move c by adding 12. X squared minus 4x is equal to positive 12. That was step number 1. Step number 2, if a does not equal to 1, divide both sides by a. Well, a does equal to 1. You can go ahead and divide it by 1 if you want to, but it'll look exactly the same. Then at that point you say, well, what is b now? b is -4. Okay, we're supposed to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides. So that is, b is -4 over 2 squared. This is what we're going to add to both sides. Well, -4 divided by 2 is a -2 squared. This is what I'm going to add to both sides. What I like to do when I'm doing this method is on the left-hand side, I leave it looking like this because the next step becomes easier if you leave it in that mode. To keep my equation balanced, I have to add the same thing to the right-hand side. So -2 squared is really a 4. I add a 4 over here. Now we're to this step. Factor or rewrite the left-hand side into this. This is x squared minus 4x plus 4. It will factor into x plus b over 2. Well, what is b over 2? b over 2 is whatever is in this parentheses. So I'm going to add -2. That's the same thing as writing -2. This, if I multiplied it back out, would be x squared minus 4x plus 4 is what I would get right there. So this is equal to this. It's just simply factored. On the right-hand side, I'm going to add these numbers together. And now, if you remember the video from last time, taking the square root of both sides, I'm ready to do that. I have something squared equals something. Let's take the square root of both sides. The square root of this is equal to plus or minus the square root of that. The square root of something squared is x minus 2. This is equal to plus or minus 4. Let's add 2 to both sides. So our two answers are going to be 2 plus 4, or 6, 2 minus 4, or -2. Those are our two answers. So that's our first example of completing the square. Let's do another one. The next one we have is x squared plus 2x plus 3. So let's look at that one. X squared plus 2x plus 3. And this is equal to 0. If we're going to use this method, move c to the right-hand side. So we need to subtract 3 to get him over there. Then if A is not 1, divide both sides by A, but A is 1, so we don't have to worry about step number 2. Step number 3, add B over 2 quantity squared to both sides. Okay, so B is 2. So if we add B over 2, we're adding 2 over 2 squared, which is really 1 squared. We're going to add it to both sides. So I'm going to say plus 1 squared, but 1 squared is really 1, so I'm just adding 1 to both sides. Now the next step is to factor or rewrite this. This will always factor into x plus whatever I see in there. Over here, negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. Now if this part right here, from here to here, looks like magic to you, this is a good one to illustrate this on. X plus 1 squared is equal to x plus 1 times x plus 1. So x times x is x squared. X times 1 is x. 1 times x is x. 1 times 1 is 1. So this is really x squared plus 2x plus 1. That is what this is. So this is not magic. I didn't just make the 2x disappear. It got factored into this. And that's what's going to happen every single time. Okay, I just wanted to go through that in case this was a mystery to people. That's how we got that. We factored it. We got this. Now we're ready. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of this, the square root of that. So let's see here. We get the square root of this is equal to plus or minus the square root of this. Okay. The square root of something squared is the something. X plus 1 is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 2. Now let's discuss this. The square root of negative 1 is I. So when you have a negative under a square root, it needs to come out as an I. So this is really plus or minus the square root of I times the square root of 2. So when we solve for x, x is negative 1 plus or minus I times the square root of 2. Here's our two answers. Negative 1 plus I square root of 2. Negative 1 minus I square root of 2. All right, let us do another example. How about number 3? And it is, now we're going to have an a leading coefficient that is not 1, so you can see how to handle that guy. So what if we've got this example? Y is equal to 2x squared minus 6x plus 9, or let's just say solve this equation. Let's solve 2x squared minus 6x plus 9 is 0. Let's solve this equation by completing the square. By the way, you can always use completing the square to solve any quadratic equation. So it's very handy. You cannot always factor something because everything's not factorable. So this is a very powerful method because you can always use it. In fact, this is how we get the quadratic formula. So we're going to use completing the square at the end of this video to derive the quadratic formula, which we're going to use for the next method. So right here, move C to the right-hand side. So we'll subtract 9. So we get 2x squared minus 6x is equal to negative 9. Now, if A is not 1, divide both sides by A. A is not 1, so we're going to divide both sides by 2, which is what A is. Then we get x squared minus 3x is negative 9 over 2. Now we're to this step, add b over 2 quantity squared. So the b that we use is this one after we've made the division. So b is negative 3. So let's add, we need to add negative 3 divided by 2 squared to both sides. This is what we're going to add. On this side, I'm going to leave it looking like this. On this side, I'm going to go ahead and square it. Negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. 2 over 2 is 4. This is what this squared is equal to that. Let's factor this. X plus whatever I see in there. Quantity squared is what this always factors into. Over here I need to add. I need a common denominator of 4. I'm going to say times 2 times 2. Negative 18 over 4 plus a 9 over 4 gives me a negative 9 over 4. All right, to finish this off, I'm to step 5, take the square root of both sides. The square root of this is equal to plus or minus the square root of that. So the square root of something squared is just the something, x minus 3 halves, is equal to plus or minus. I have a negative in there, it needs to come out, 9 over 4. Okay, we can clean this up some more. The square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2. So x is going to be equal to I'm going to add 3 halves, plus or minus I, the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2. This two answers are 3 over 2 plus I plus I times 3 over 2, 3 over 2 minus I times 3 over 2. So these are complex number. This is the real part, this is the imaginary part. Real part, imaginary part. So we'll talk about the significance of imaginary roots a little bit later. Okay, let's do one more example and then we will derive the quadratic formula. Okey-doke. The last one is 3x squared. 3x squared minus 12x is equal to negative 3. Okay, most of these we have started in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c. But if you're solving by completing the square, and you realize that c is already on the other side, you've got step 1 done. So if you realize that, then you're ready to go on to step 2, which says if a is not 1, divide both sides by a. A is not 1, it is 3. So let's divide both sides by 3. So this gives us x squared minus 4x is equal to negative 1. Now we're ready to add b over 2, quantity squared, to both sides. We use this number to be our b, so b over 2, quantity squared, is negative 4 over 2, quantity squared, which is really a negative 2 squared. So I'm going to say plus negative 2 squared plus 4. Let's square this. This will always factor into x plus whatever I see in there, minus 2, quantity squared, is equal to 3. Now we just take the square root of both sides. The square root of this is equal to plus or minus the square root of that. The square root of something squared is just the something plus or minus square root of 3. We add 2 to both sides. Our two answers are 2 plus square root of 3, 2 minus the square root of 3. Now, let's derive the quadratic formula using completing the square. And then that will give us another method we can solve quadratic equations by. So I think you all have probably heard of the quadratic formula. But if you haven't, this is where it comes from. Let's take this, ax squared plus bx plus c, and let's solve for x by completing the square. So let's move c to the right-hand side. So we'll subtract c. Now, if a is not 1, divide both sides by a. I don't know what a is, so I'm going to divide both sides by a. That gives me a over a is just 1, so I get x squared plus b over a times x is equal to negative c over a. This is what I've got so far. Now I'm to step 3, which says add b over 2 quantity squared to both sides. Okay, well, b, in this case, is b over a. And if I divide that by 2, right, that's b over a times 1/2, keep, change, flip. So b over a divided by 2 is going to give me b over 2a. So this squared is what I need to add to both sides, plus b over 2a squared. If I go ahead and square that, that's going to be b squared, 2a times 2a is 4a squared when I square down there. All right, now I need to factor, right? This will always factor into x plus whatever I see in there, quantity squared. Now, if I want to add these together, I need a common denominator. Let's get a common denominator of 4a squared. I already have an a, so let's multiply this by 4a. 4a. So what I get here is 4a squared negative 4ac plus b squared over 4a squared. That's what I get, which I can write as one fraction, 4a squared, and I could write the b in the front, b squared minus 4ac. Over here I have x plus b over 2a squared. Now we are ready to take the square root of both sides because we have something squared equals something. So let's take the square root of both sides. The square root of this is equal to plus or minus the square root of that. The square root of something squared is equal to plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. Okay, let's clean this up. I can move the b over 2a, so x is equal to negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over the square root of 4a squared, but the square root of 4a squared is the square root of 4, which is 2, and the square root of a squared, which is a, and this is 2a. So this is where, if you've heard of the quadratic formula, x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That is where the quadratic formula comes from, and that's what we're going to be doing on our next video. We're going to be solving quadratic equations by quadratic formula.